Good day, everyone. I'm Lee Arkanal, and today I want to talk to you about how to refine a hunt query that's generating too many false positives. First, let's address the stigma around false positives. In threat hunting, it's normal to encounter mostly benign or routine activity in your network, and that's just the nature of threat hunting. This happens because if attackers are trying to blend in to your environment, they'll often use the same techniques and tools and commands as legitimate users, including things like encoded PowerShell commands. I've talked to many other threat hunters in the community about PowerShell encoded commands. Some tell me they rarely see encoded commands and they can treat that like an alert or detection, while others say that it's quite common in their environment. Both experiences are extremely valid. What's important is not to be overwhelmed by the data. So let's dive into how we can tune our queries to be more effective and keep the process manageable. How do I tackle out tuning false positives? In the lab, we've developed what we call pre-hunt discovery queries. These are preliminary queries that you can run before deploying our hunt packages, or after you run a hunt package that returns a lot of false positives, you can adjust the initial query to reflect the same intent while examining the data from a new angle. In this example, I'm going to use the PowerShell encoded command execution hunt package within the Hunter platform. You can find this in the suggested starting hunt packages hunt package collection. This hunt package is a part of our community edition, accessible to anyone with an account, and it's one we've received extensive feedback on. We've included the link to this hunt package as well as the link for you to get your free community account in the description. All right, let's grab our query from the hunt package and start hunting. So we're going to scroll down, and in this case, we're going to use Splunk, which is one of my all-time favorites, but we're also going to use the log source Sysmon. So we're going to copy, we're going to jump over to Splunk. Here we are in Splunk, and like I said, I'm using Sysmon as my log source, mainly because it captures data and utilizes fields very similar to what an EDR displays. Also, I've run my query using the all-time time selector due to the constraints of living in a lab environment. Now, I see only 36,000, almost 37,000 events are being returned when I use the all-time time selector, which could represent about 15 minutes or like an hour in most corporate or production environments. Now, hunters from the community tell me that because their environment is so large sometimes, they can get up to 2 million events in just 15 minutes. That's a lot of data. And that's a lot of false positives, possibly. In my best effort to attempt to scale to those large environments, I've used the all-time time selector, although I do not recommend doing this in a production environment. Let's talk about the query real quick. We are looking for the child process, or in Sysmon's case, the image, ending with PowerShell, and we leverage this regular expression to capture the variations of the encoded command parameter that is required for PowerShell to successfully execute an encoded command. Looking at the data, it returned 42 unique instances, which may not be a lot. But if you run this hunt and find more events, the question is, how do we adjust our data to identify common artifacts and process chains that exist within our environment? Also, how can we add different artifacts that will let us see into the data a bit better, like parent processes? Enter the pre-hunt discovery query. What is the goal of the pre-hunt discovery query? In this case, we want to identify the most common parent process that has a child that is executing PowerShell encoded commands. At first glance, you may notice some familiar features to the hunt query that we had in the hunt package or that we extracted from the hunt package. And that's very true. We kept the intent of the original query, keeping the child process ending in PowerShell, and using the regular expression that gathers the variations of the encoded command parameter. Then we changed how the fields displayed the data, or we did some modification to the stats. We've added some fields to collect more artifacts, sorted by parent process, concatenated counts to the end of each parent image, extracted the counts using regex, converted them to strings to the numbers for sorting, and organized the data from most to least common. What does this do? In a nutshell, this approach helps us identify common process chains and artifacts based on frequency and distribution across endpoints. All this information, plus your tribal knowledge, helps you better understand what activity exists in your environment and what can be considered a false positive. I will always recommend researching your findings internally and applying that tribal knowledge before dismissing anything from the data or any values. And in this case, you can use a tool like CyberChef to decode these PowerShell encoded commands, but some EDRs actually have a built-in capability to decode the command inside of it. So check for the documentation, you may find something interesting. So where do we begin? Let's take a look at the data. We see PowerShell as the parent and child process. So looking at the top header, we have the parent images ending in PowerShell. We scroll way over past the parent command line arguments. We can see, there we are, that the child process or image ends in PowerShell as well. Now, if we go back, we see that inside of the parent command line arguments, there is an encoded command, and there's also a PowerShell encoded command in the child command line arguments. Now, this allows us to identify the relationship between these artifacts and the process chain we can use to exclude these. So if we wanted to, how we can approach this, and I'm going to have to scroll all the way over, is that we can focus on the parent process, parent command line arguments, the artifacts that live in the child process, as well as the child process command line arguments. I'm not going to show this because it's going to take some time, especially to scroll all the way over. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on PowerShell being the parent image. I'm going to take the first chunk of characters from the parent command line argument, or the encoded PowerShell command within the parent command line arguments. And I'm also going to do the same for the child process. So it ends in PowerShell. And I'm going to grab quite a couple characters from the command line arguments within the child process command line. And what this should do is isolate that entire process chain and then not remove any other values in case we're trying to be as specific as possible. So we don't want to affect any of the other values that we haven't really dived into yet. So how did we approach this? Well, we used the and not operator within Splunk. And then we isolated this, once again, this process chain, using specific values. As you can see, I use the parent image, ends in PowerShell.exe. Parent command line contains that first chunk of the PowerShell encoded command. And the image ends in PowerShell.exe and contains the first chunk of the child command line arguments, the encoded command within the child command line arguments. Now you may say, well, looking at the statistics, that only removed one unique instance. And you're right, it did, because we focused on a single process chain. So we only wanted to remove that. But what that does is that leaves off almost 11,500 events. So that's making your query a little more resource, or a little less resource intensive. Now, what if you want to make a big impact on the unique instances versus how much data you get back? So there's a constant war between these two numbers. So this was around 37,000 events, but now we're only down to 1,747 unique instances. Well, what if you want to really impact this? Because if you sit here and scroll and scroll and scroll, you'll see a lot of spaces, and I mean, that means you have to sift through 1,700 unique instances. Well, let's approach that. Let's take a look at the data. I'm going to use my top hitter as an example, and we see that the parent image is command.exe, which is interesting. Then we see this parameter that sticks out to me, because this is one of the common pieces of feedback and one of the values that we get, is that my PowerShell command, or in the command line arguments, contains execution policy. Now, this has also been described as a legitimate tool, as a legitimate flag, and most of the false positives come from here. So what happens if we remove that? What if we add another and not clause and remove something that, and once again, I recommend doing the research within your organization of how often execution policy is used before you dismiss or remove that value from the data. So first we went specific. Now we're kind of going on a very general exclusion. So let's see what happens. After we applied the very general and very vague exclusion of execution policy within the parent command line arguments, now let's take a look at the numbers. we only have 975 events being returned and 100 unique instances. Now, this makes the data much more manageable, but once again, please do this at the discretion of your tribal knowledge and your business processes that are within your organization. I use this as an example. This example may not ring true in your organization, but let's keep moving on and pretending that this is exactly what we're expecting. So now that I see 100 results, now this is much more manageable. This is something I can scroll through and read the process chain. I can look at the parent image. I can look at the child image and actually get an idea of what's going on. Now, if I scroll down, you'll see a lot of gaps, and scrolling up, there's a lot of space because there's some fields that are capturing a lot of data, which are the command line argument fields. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these fields so that I can get a much better look at what the parent process is and what the child process is. So I'm going to come up here, remove parent command line and the comma. I'll remove this parent process count. No, I'm going to keep that. I'm going to remove the command line or the child command line arguments. And this next stats figure is going to look a lot more manageable and something that we can actually look at directly. And let's look for some examples. Now that we remove those fields, now we actually have a different number of unique instances, which we've reduced it even further down to 40. Now, this could be a good thing, this could be a bad thing, because we did remove some artifacts that may indicate that there is a commonality or there is a big difference. That's part of the process of trying to figure that out. Looking at those artifacts, seeing what is unique, seeing what is common, those fields and those values are really important as well. But this is just a different look at it. Simply by removing those, now we can look at interesting process chains, and now we can look at a limited set of data that we could possibly find malicious or suspicious activity in. Now, remember, we could always reintroduce those fields to the stats field or whatever aggregation you use or whatever tool you're using later on once you find something that's interesting. So let's just go through the data and see what we can find. Now, I know I probably didn't mention this earlier, but something you can use to determine what is possibly normal, what is possibly abnormal, is looking at the different fields. So we've included like the computer. So if you see a bunch of host names that are running something, it could mean that, if there's a lot of them, that this could be normal activity. But like I mentioned, these artifacts are supposed to help you understand what's going on in your environment so that you can better understand what normal activity looks like. But let's scroll through. We see PowerShell executing PowerShell, WMI, we see WinWord. Okay, that sticks out right away. We see WinWord.exe executing PowerShell. So I would probably set this aside as a finding and say, you know what, let's hunt for this later. As we go down, we see command. Okay, we see command as we continue going on. But then we see some more interesting things. Right, stage 2, VX Underground. We see AnyDesk.exe. And the list goes on and on. But now you can see the count. Now, of course, Notepad, one of my favorites. But now you can see how the artifacts show you what might be suspicious. We have things executing from downloads directories. We see app data local temp. If you see syswow64, that could mean something's up. Users public directories and so on. But these pre-hunt discovery queries are designed to help you visualize those artifacts while still maintaining the intent of the initial hunt. Because this is all capturing PowerShell encoded command execution, but we looked at it a little differently than the initial results showed us. I hope this quick tutorial was a good demonstration of how tuning plays a role in the threat hunting process, and how by applying time and the good old rinse and repeat mentality, you can significantly reduce the noise, allowing you to uncover more relevant findings. Imagine if you ran the initial query for 15 minutes and had over 100,000 events return. Once you start applying this theory and you exclude things, that may allow you to start searching over longer time. So instead of 15 minutes, go to an hour, rinse and repeat, find things that are normal, exclude them, go to 4 hours, find the normal activity, and so on. If you keep rinsing, repeating, what you're eventually going to have is an exclusion list that captures enough normal and expected activity that allows you to hunt for over a much larger amount of time. That's all for now. Now stay tuned for more threat hunting content, stay safe, take care, and as always, happy hunting.